So the first video for this week, we're going to start looking at America as it is going to industrialize over the course of the late 18 and early 1900s. As far as the United States, they were not the first industrial power to exist, though they will become the largest for a period of time. Initially, global competition as far as industrialization was dominated by Great Britain. Their industrial power was increasingly stronger over the course of the 1800s, and Germany also played a very large role in this early period of industrialization. By the 1870s, the United States industrial output did begin to surge. So starting in 1870, you can see that the United States made up about 23.3% of global manufacturing, and by the time you get to 1913, it's actually going to account for around 35.8%. So with this economic growth, the United States gross domestic product quadrupled between 1860 and 1890, and the number of industrial workers also had to double in order to meet the demands of this industrial age. It means that there are a lot of farmers who are now going to be working in factories, and immigrant labor will also be used in these new jobs. We'll focus a little bit more on the railroads themselves in a future video when we look at the West, but I think it's important to go ahead and point out that the expansion of railroads connected the nation and played a very, very important role in stimulating industrial growth. So for example, it's going to help to facilitate the transportation of different goods from one part of the United States to another, and it's also going to be very important for helping to ensure that there are national markets for different types of products. Now with this, some of the most important industrial products that people are going to be consuming, we're thinking about things like steel, coal, glass, but of course more finished products are also going to become more important as well. People who start moving to the West are going to initially maybe be a little bit timid about this type of move because they're going to have to leave a lot of their creature comforts back in the East. But as people are able to have things that they might desire, like books or art or furniture, shipped from all over the country to all other parts of the country, it becomes a little bit more feasible and desirable. We can see that with the railroads, again, we'll talk about them more in the future, but in 1886, the consolidation of railroads and the adoption of a more standard system and gauge helped to resolve any previous logistical issues. In other words, there's more standardization. And additionally, in 1882, railroads are also going to have standardized time zones, which will help to make scheduling to get goods from one side of the country to the other a little bit more effective and a little bit easier. For the railroads, they are also going to be mass consumers of products as well. So as they start to build more railroads, they have to have more iron, they have to have more steel. So with that, it's going to continue to help leading to this growth. We can also start to think a little bit, if we're thinking about America industrializing, how important innovations and inventions would have been. So the inventions that we have today, things like smartphones, internet, computers, these are all going to be very, very fastly evolving forms of technology. Up until the early sort of 1900s and even into, if we look further back, the 1800s, humans had communicated in much the same way for hundreds of years. Either you communicated with someone directly, or you would have been able to potentially send them a letter or something that was written to communicate. So over the course of the 1800s, starting with inventions like the typewriter in 1868, carbon paper in 1872, and even adding machines in 1891, there's more technology that's being produced. By the time you get to 1900, there are going to be more than 1.5 million telephones that are going to connect users across the United States, with Alexander Graham Bell's invention really helping to revolutionize the way people are able to communicate with one another. With this, we can see that this is an absolute shift. It means that people are able to get in contact with one another far more quickly than they have in the past. There's going to be growth in a lot of other industries as well. For example, I think one of the biggest innovators of this time that we think of is going to be with Thomas Edison, but of course with that comes a little bit of issue as far as understanding who Edison was as a person. So the pictures that I have up here, over to your left you're going to see Thomas Edison, and then to the right you're going to see Nikola Tesla. These are going to be two men who are going to clash during their time, and we can also think about how potentially Edison might have used some of Tesla's inventions as his own. So Effectively, what's taking place and some of the debate here is going to have to do with light bulbs. I guarantee you that most of us are using some sort of a light right now, and they're very convenient. So inconvenient, in fact, and so readily available that we barely even think about them at this point. But what had happened is that as light bulbs were invented, the first ones that were created were relatively dangerous. They were very prone to catching fire. They were very prone to exploding, and because of that, people were very wary of them. You don't want to have street lights that are exploding and causing fires and setting entire towns on fire. So with that, we can see that for Thomas Edison, he is going to attempt to create what is known as a direct current form of electricity and a light bulb that can run on this direct current. On the other hand, you were going to have Nikola Tesla, who had a very different life. So he actually started out his life relatively nomadic. He was Serbian, and he did a lot of, I guess what we could consider almost like nomadic wandering. So his family would move from place to place throughout Eastern Europe, where he would go to school, he would take classes, and then eventually for Tesla, he was able to come to the United States. He wanted to create what later became known as AC currents, and the AC currents ended up being a far better solution than the direct currents that were being proposed by Thomas Edison. Now, for Tesla, he ended up working for Edison for around 6 months. At first, he claimed he was really excited. For Tesla, Edison was someone who was kind of like an idol to him. He had the money, he had the experience, he had the connections to really help make his dreams come true so that he could become one of these great inventors and really use his mind and use his ideas to better humankind. However, with this, we can see he only actually worked for Edison for around 6 months. He worked on the side doing all kinds of odd jobs to make as much money as he possibly could. Some even say he did a lot of grave digging to try and make money so that he could open his own sort of invention factory, if you will, so that he could have his own ideas patented and not have to work for Edison any longer. Of course, with this, there's also going to be the issue and the question of if Edison stole some of Tesla's ideas. And many historians come down on the fact that for Edison, he stole a lot of people's ideas potentially. So when people would come to work for him, he sort of saw their ideas and their knowledge as his own, and he would take those ideas, have them patented for himself. So with that, what is going to happen is that eventually we will see that Tesla's ideas of AC currents over the DC currents proposed by Edison will become far more superior. They will become far better. But of course, I think it's important to bring up those types of controversies because it's only been in recent years that you actually see Tesla being talked about a little bit more. Of course, having a car named Tesla has probably helped to spur on people looking into who this actually was as a person. But I do think that it's very important to sort of give that a little credence. For most of the early industrialization that the United States saw, a lot of it took place in the north. Some of it took place a little bit towards the west, but the South, up until the end of the Civil War, and really as you get into the 1880s, had kind of fallen behind when it came to actual industrialization. Because of this, we can see that there are a lot of Southerners, particularly newspaper editors, men like Henry W. Grady, who put forward this idea of the New South Creed. It's going to be a slogan that's pushed not just by the newspaper editors, but also by planters and businessmen to help figure out how to get the region more industrialized. One thing they do is they emphasize the fact that the South has a lot of natural resources, particularly coal and timber, but there are also already ironworks in places like Virginia. There are salt works in places like Virginia as well. There's available land. There was also a labor force. With this, they pointed to the fact that with the labor force, it was relatively inexpensive compared to the North. Were they paid fair wages? We'll talk about that in the next video, but regardless, an inexpensive labor force nonetheless. And because of that, we start to see more strategies actually start to emerge in the South to help push this idea of a New South Creed and creating this sort of Southern industrialization. So, for example, states offered tax exemptions to help attract Northern investments. Prisons are also going to start leasing convicts into industries to help create a cheap labor pool. We'll talk more in just a second about how that system is going to be exploited and how very particularly African Americans are going to be the ones who are going to be forced into the system more than anyone else. We can see that federal lands are also going to be sold to speculators for resource exploitation at a relatively cheap price. And a lot of these large land tracts are also going to be provided to railroads to help encourage more infrastructure and development. So with the New South, I want to take just a couple of minutes to look a little bit at what these industries would have looked like and what some of the key industries were. Up here, I have a map that is going to show you a little of this. So what you see here is that there are several major railroads that are going to be connecting in the South. This number, of course, might seem a bit less than what's taking place in different parts of the Midwest and the North, but again, still very substantial to see an increase in railroads. This is going to allow more rural regions, places like West Virginia, places like Eastern Tennessee, and even different parts of Alabama and Mississippi to now be more connected with industrial hubs in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, of course, places like New York City. And so that's going to be very important. The next thing you can kind of see here is going to be the textile manufacturing centers. These are highlighted with the lines that are on this map. We're going to look more specifically at textile manufacturing in the next video, specifically because it is something, as you can see here, that is going to impact different parts of North Carolina, including places like Guilford and Alamance County. You also have the iron and coal mining regions. Many of those had already existed in parts of Virginia, so Richmond, Virginia, as well as different parts of Western Virginia, like the Kanawha Valley, are going to already have pretty intense industries. And then you still have cotton growth that is going to be represented down here in this mid-green color. And then you still do have some tobacco growing regions, which will lead to the emergence of more tobacco factories in those areas. So to give you just a little bit more information about these industries, we can see that for the railroads, post-war expansion did help to connect the South with the North as well as with the West, and really did facilitate this sort of economic integration into the United States. Convicts, however, are going to often be used to build a lot of this infrastructure under the convict lease system. With this particular system, what would happen is that someone who was convicted of a crime, instead of just serving their prison sentence, they would also daily have to go and work. With this system, they were not paid, and instead they would have to work for free. The issue with the convict lease system here is that, number one, people are not being paid for their labor, and number two, there were a lot of people who were convicted of crimes that they probably didn't actually commit. So someone might be convicted of something like standing around on a street corner for too long, or what they might have called loitering. Someone might be convicted of something as simple as what we would consider jaywalking, or walking across the street without having the actual right of way to do so. And instead of getting, just a fine or a ticket, they would be put in jail and used for their labor. We also see that a lot of African Americans are going to receive the sort of blunt of this type of punishment, and they are going to be forced to work for these railroad companies for free. So I think it's really important to point that out as well. As far as textile mills, those are mostly going to be centered in the Carolinas as well as Georgia. They are going to capitalize on the abundance of cotton coming from the deeper South, and they also really capitalize on families who are going to be willing to work in these mills. So as fewer people are able to make a living working as farmers or working just subsistently, they can't afford their land anymore, issues with that, they are going to instead start working in these textile mills where they will work for very, very low wages. Same thing with tobacco factories. We can see that James B. Duke helped to develop cigarette manufacturing as an empire in North Carolina, and tobacco pressing involved a very, very large division of labor. So some of the nastier work when it comes to tobacco production would be performed by African Americans, particularly African American women. So things like preparing the tobacco for actual production, And then you'll see that white workers are going to operate the machinery, so they're not actually having to handle the tobacco. With these factories, oftentimes the conditions were not ideal. A lot of sicknesses did spread within these factories. It did lead to the loss of a lot of life, and there weren't as many standards as there are today. But I think that's all for this video. Next time we'll talk a little bit more about the factories that are going to emerge, particularly in places like Alamance, Guilford, Rockingham County, so in nearby areas, and maybe look a little bit more at these factories and how they are going to function, how they work, and the impact that it has on both ordinary everyday people as well as industrialists who are going to definitely benefit from this new emergence of increased industrialization.